When my daughter-in-law leaned over my body lying broken in a dry creek bed, the first thing she said wasn't call an ambulance. It was just leave him. If he dies out here, nobody's going to ask questions about an old man's heart giving out in this heat. My son stood 3 feet behind her, holding my hat, and he didn't say a single word to stop her. Before I tell you exactly what happened after that, and how my late wife had already made sure they would lose absolutely everything the moment they left me there, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family loyalty has to be earned, not assumed. My name is Walter Coleman. I'm 64 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a county land title examiner, which means I spent 3 decades reading the fine print other people never bother to read. Property lines, ownership disputes, forged signatures on deeds. Nobody thought anyone would ever check again. I'd seen every trick a greedy relative could pull on paper, long before I ever imagined one of them would try it on me. The morning it started, I was face down in a dry creek bed on the western edge of my late wife's ranch, and my right leg wasn't working the way it was supposed to. I'd gone out at dawn to help move 40 head of cattle to the upper pasture before the heat came in, the way I'd done every summer since Margaret and I inherited this land. My horse spooked at a rattlesnake coiled in the grass, and I went down hard onto rock. I heard something crack in my shin before I felt it. By the time the pain caught up to the sound, I was already lying in 6 inches of sun-baked gravel, staring up at a sky that was turning white with heat, and I could hear 2 voices coming toward me through the sagebrush. I thought it was rescue. For about 4 seconds lying there with my leg on fire, I actually felt relief. Then I heard Vanessa's voice, clear as a bell, talking not to me but to my son. "Derek, look at him. He can barely move." This is exactly what Dr. Whitmore warned us about. His heart, this heat, a fall like that, just leave him. If he dies out here, nobody's going to ask questions about an old man's heart giving out in this heat. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence was the first stone in an avalanche that would bury my son's entire life within 4 months. The silence after she said it was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Somewhere behind me, a meadowlark kept singing, completely indifferent, like the world hadn't just tilted sideways. A horsefly landed on the back of my hand, and I didn't have the strength to shake it off. Nobody moved. Not Derek, not Vanessa, not the wind. For 3 or 4 seconds, the only thing that existed in that entire dry creek bed was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow against the gravel. She talked about me the way you'd talk about an old fence post you'd been meaning to replace for years. Something that had outlived its usefulness and was finally, conveniently, falling down on its own. Was I really hearing this? Was my own son really standing there letting it happen? And how long exactly had they been planning to be standing in this exact spot when it did? I want to tell you something about myself before I go any further into what happened next. I don't come from money the way Vanessa always assumed I did once she found out about the ranch. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house behind a feed store in Buffalo, Wyoming. I put myself through community college doing title searches for a law firm that paid me $11 an hour, and I worked my way into the county recorder's office by the time I was 26. I married a woman named Margaret Whitfield, whose family had run cattle on 14,000 acres of high plains grass for 4 generations, and I never once, not for a single day of our 38 years together, let anyone forget that the ranch was hers before it was ever mine. Margaret died 8 months before that morning in the creek bed. I won't dwell on it here, except to say that the last real conversation we had, 3 weeks before the end, wasn't about medicine or hospice or any of the things you'd expect. It was about Derek, and about the way Vanessa looked at the ranch whenever she visited. Not the way you look at land you love, but the way you look at a number on a spreadsheet. I should have listened harder to that conversation than I did. Derek was 34 years old working some kind of business development job in Denver that involved a great deal of talk about portfolios and very little actual work with his hands. He'd married Vanessa 4 years earlier, a sharp, image-conscious woman who ran a moderately successful home staging business and who had, from the very first Thanksgiving I met her, asked more questions about the ranch's acreage than about anything else in our family. lying in that creek bed, waiting to find out whether my son was going to let his wife's words become the last words I ever heard. I thought about all the ways I'd made excuses for both of them over the years. The wedding I paid for in full. The down payment on their Denver condo I quietly wired without telling anyone, not even Margaret, because Derek had begged me not to make him look weak in front of his new wife. $2 or $3 figures like that don't sound like much when you say them out loud, but they represented years of overtime, years of me saying yes, so my son wouldn't have to hear the word no from his own father. Derek. My voice came out cracked and dry against the gravel. Are you hearing this? Are you going to say something? There was a long pause. I heard boots shift in the dirt, and then my son, the boy I had taught to saddle a horse before he could tie his own shoes, said the words that told me everything I needed to know about where the next several months of my life were headed. Dad, just stay still. We're figuring it out. Figuring it out, not calling for help. Figuring it out, I want to be honest with you about something, because if this story is going to mean anything at all, it has to be honest. I have made mistakes as a father. I was not always the man standing between Derek and the world the way I should have been. There was a stretch of years, right after he left for college, when I let my own quiet, stubborn nature do the parenting for me. I assumed that if I simply kept showing up, kept paying, kept staying silent about the things that worried me, that silence would somehow read as love. It didn't. It read as absence. And a son who grows up sensing his father's love only through checks and never through hard conversations learns, eventually, to measure everyone else's love the exact same way. That's not an excuse for what Vanessa said in that creek bed. But it is the truth, and I'd rather tell it to you straight than pretend I arrived at 64 years old as some kind of flawless old man wronged by a wicked younger generation. I had a hand in shaping the son who stood over me and said, "We're figuring it out," instead of "I've got you, Dad." What neither of them knew, what almost nobody in that whole county knew, because I had spent 31 years learning exactly how to keep a piece of paper invisible until the moment it needed to be seen, was that 4 months after Margaret's diagnosis, long before either of us knew how little time she had left, she had asked me to drive with her to the county archive building, where I'd worked for 3 decades. She wanted to see something. What she showed me that day, in a temperature-controlled records room, I still had access to through an old colleague, was a page torn from a leather-bound recorder's ledger dated 1961. It was the original handwritten entry recording the transfer of 14,000 acres from her grandfather, Ezra Whitfield, into the sole and separate name of his daughter, Margaret's mother, under a specific territorial era exemption that kept certain family ranch land outside the reach of any future husband's creditors, debts, or claims. That same clause, carried forward through every subsequent transfer, meant the ranch had never once in over 60 years become shared marital property. It had passed from one Whitfield woman to the next, always in a single name, always protected. Margaret had inherited it that way, and 3 months before she died, working quietly with an estate attorney named Diane Ashcroft, she had made absolutely certain it would leave her estate the exact same way. I didn't know it yet. Lying in that creek bed with my leg broken and my daughter-in-law's voice still ringing in my ears, but the woman who had loved me for 38 years had already built a wall around everything Vanessa and Derek were about to try to steal, a wall made of paper so old, so specific, and so completely outside the world of trust funds and mortgages that neither of them would even know it existed until it was far too late to stop it. What I did know, in that moment, was that I needed to survive the next hour without giving either of them the satisfaction of knowing I'd heard what Vanessa said. I let my breathing go shallow. I let my eyes lose focus. I made myself as small and as harmless and as finished as I possibly could, because the man lying broken in that creek bed had just learned something no title examiner ever wants to learn about his own family, that the people closest to you will read a piece of land the same way they'd read a deed with a mistake in it, hunting for the smallest gap in the fence line where they can slip through and claim what was never legally or morally theirs. Vanessa knelt down next to me, and for one disorienting second, I thought she might have changed her mind. Instead, she reached into the front pocket of my work shirt, pulled out my cell phone, and stood back up. "We'll call somebody once we're back at the house," she said, brushing dust off her knees like she'd just finished gardening. "It's a 20-minute walk. He'll be fine." 20 minutes in that heat, with a broken leg and a heart condition she'd just used as a threat 2 minutes earlier. I understood, lying there, that I was not looking at panic or bad judgment. I was looking at a calculation. They left me there for 51 minutes. I know, because I counted the shadows moving across a fence post the whole time, the same way I used to count property markers walking a boundary line for the county, one slow measured breath at a time, refusing to let the fear win. When Derek finally came back, alone, his face pale, his hands shaking in a way that told me some small, buried piece of his conscience had finally caught up to him, he half carried, half dragged me to the truck and drove me to the hospital in Sheridan without another word passing between us. At the emergency room, while a doctor set my leg and asked me gently, more than once, whether anyone had witnessed my fall, I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I told the doctor I'd been alone. I told the nurse the same thing. I looked my son directly in the eye while I said it, and I watched something break open behind his expression. Not gratitude, not yet, but the first crack of understanding that his father had just protected him from a question that could have changed both of their lives forever. I wasn't protecting Derek because I'd forgiven him. I was protecting myself. A furious old man with a broken leg making wild accusations against his own son and daughter-in-law from a hospital bed is exactly the kind of person people start describing with words like confused and unstable and needs to be looked after. I had spent 31 years watching families destroy vulnerable relatives with exactly that language. I was not about to hand Vanessa the very weapon she needed. Instead, from that hospital bed, with my leg elevated and a cast setting around my shin, I picked up the phone and called the one person who already knew exactly what Margaret and I had built to protect this land. "Diane," I said, when Ashcroft's sharp, unhurried voice came on the line, "I need you to activate the file, all of it, and I need you to understand this isn't a precaution anymore." There was a pause, the particular silence of a very good lawyer doing very fast math. "Walter," she said finally, "tell me what happened." So I told her. All of it, the creek bed, the 51 minutes, the sentence about my heart giving out in the heat that I would carry in my chest for the rest of my life, whether I wanted to or not. When I finished, Diane didn't offer sympathy, and I was grateful for that. What she offered instead was exactly what I needed. "Margaret built something extraordinary to protect that ranch," she said. "But Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want to stop this today? I can have documentation of what happened in that creek bed in front of a judge by Friday. Or do you want to let them keep going?" I looked up at the ceiling tiles of that hospital room, thinking about 51 minutes of shadows crawling across a fence post, thinking about the boy I'd raised standing 3 feet away saying, "We're figuring it out." "Let them keep going," I said. "I want to see exactly how far they're willing to walk before they realize there was never any ground left under their feet at all." I didn't know yet how far that would turn out to be. I didn't know about Marcus Bell, the man Vanessa had been meeting for coffee in Denver twice a month for the better part of a year, a man who specialized in exactly the kind of luxury guest ranch development that turns 14,000 acres of working cattle land into a 9-figure resort listing. I didn't know that the plan forming in my daughter-in-law's mind that afternoon was already 3 steps ahead of anything my own son understood, and I certainly didn't know that within 6 weeks they would be sitting at my own kitchen table with a forged medical directive and a hired notary, asking me to sign away the only piece of my late wife I had left, but I was about to find out. And when I did, I intended to be ready in a way neither of them could have imagined, because unlike them, I had spent 31 years of my life learning that the truth about who owns a piece of land is never really decided by who's standing on it the loudest. It's decided by a single line written a long time ago, by someone patient enough to make sure it could never be erased. I want to pause here and tell you about the weeks that followed, because they will show you exactly How deep this had already gone before I ever understood the full shape of it. For 3 days after I came home from the hospital, Derek barely spoke to me. He moved through the house like a man carrying something heavy he couldn't put down, refilling my water glass without being asked, avoiding my eyes whenever Vanessa was in the room. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house when one person inside it knows they've done something unforgivable and is waiting to see whether the silence will be enough to bury it. That was the quiet that lived with us that week. Vanessa, on the other hand, was in constant motion. On the fourth day, I woke from a nap in my recliner to find her standing in the doorway of my study with a stack of glossy brochures in her hands. Mountain lodge developments, luxury cabin communities, a rendering of a spa building with floor-to-ceiling windows facing a mountain range that looked suspiciously like the one visible from my own back porch. "I just think," she said, setting the brochures on the table beside me with the careful gentleness of someone handling a sleeping child, "that at your age, managing 14,000 acres alone is a lot. Especially now, especially after what happened out there." I looked at the brochures, I looked at her, and I did something I had learned to do very well over 31 years of sitting across desks from people who were trying to take something that wasn't legally theirs. I let my face show nothing at all. "I'll think about it," I said. That was the moment the trap I had already set with Diane Ashcroft began, quietly, to close. "I'm going to stop here for now. Type 1 if you'd like me to continue." They came at me for the first time on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after the accident, and they did it with a kindness so carefully rehearsed that if I hadn't spent 3 decades reading fraudulent paperwork for a living, I might almost have believed it. Vanessa had cooked dinner, an actual home-cooked meal, the first one she'd ever made in my house in 4 years of marriage to my son, and she'd set the table with the good plates, the ones Margaret and I had received as a wedding gift, and used maybe a dozen times in 38 years. Derek poured me a glass of wine I hadn't asked for. There was soft music playing from a speaker on the counter. I sat down at my own kitchen table and understood, within about 90 seconds, that I was watching 2 people perform a scene they had rehearsed more than once. "Dad," Derek said, once the plates were cleared, "we wanted to talk to you about something. Together, as a family." I folded my hands on the table and waited. I had learned, examining land titles for 3 decades, that the person trying hardest to sound reasonable is usually the person with the least reasonable thing to ask. "We've been so worried since the accident," Vanessa said, reaching across the table to rest her hand on mine. Her nails were freshly manicured, a soft, expensive shade of rose. "You could have died out there, Walter, and it made us realize, Derek and I both, that we need a plan, in case something like that happens again." "What kind of plan?" I said. It wasn't really a question. I already knew the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a familiar deed before you've even finished reading the legal description. Derek slid a folder across the table. Inside it was a document titled Durable Power of Attorney, dense with the kind of language most people sign without reading closely, full authority over financial accounts, property transactions, medical decisions, all of it granted, in this draft, to my son and, notably, to Vanessa as co-agent. "It's just a precaution," Derek said, and I watched him avoid my eyes exactly the way he had in the hospital hallway 6 weeks earlier. "If anything ever happened to you, a fall, a heart problem, we wouldn't want to be stuck, fighting through red tape while you needed help." I looked at the document for a long moment, long enough that I watched Vanessa's manicured fingers tighten almost imperceptibly around her wine glass. "I'll have my own attorney look it over," I said. "That's standard practice. I wouldn't sign anything without that, and neither should you." The temperature in the room changed instantly, the way weather changes on the high plains. Clear sky to hailstorm inside of 5 minutes. "Walter, we don't have time for lawyers," Vanessa said, and the gentle voice from a moment earlier had already gone brittle at the edges. "This is a family matter. Bringing outside people into it, it sends a message, don't you think, that you don't trust your own son." There it was. The oldest trick in the book, and I had watched 100 families destroy themselves with it over the years. Reframe every legal protection as a betrayal of love. so that the person being asked to protect themselves feels guilty for doing the one sensible thing available to them. I trust my son, I said quietly, looking directly at Derek rather than at her. That's exactly why I want this done properly, for his protection as much as mine. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't argue, but he didn't defend me either. And the silence he left in the space where a son's loyalty should have lived told me everything about which direction this particular wind was blowing. I want to tell you something honest here, because I promised you honesty at the start of this. Sitting at that table, watching my son fail to meet my eyes for the second time in 6 weeks, I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was grief. A living, breathing kind of grief. The kind you feel for someone who is still standing right in front of you. I had buried my wife 8 months earlier, and I understood, at that kitchen table, that I was now watching the slow, quiet burial of the boy I'd raised, one silence at a time. I told them I needed a few days to think it over. Vanessa's smile came back on like a light switch, all warmth restored, as though the previous 90 seconds had never happened. Of course, she said, no rush at all. That was a lie, and we both knew it. But I let her have it, because I had learned something from 31 years of examining deeds that most people never learn from a single lifetime. The person in a hurry to close a transaction is always the person with the most to hide. The next morning, I drove into town and sat across from Diane Ashcroft's desk with the folder Derek had given me. Diane read through it twice, slowly, the way she read everything, and then set it down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. This isn't just broad, she said. It's aggressive. Full authority over real property transactions, no requirement for a second signature, no expiration clause. Walter, if you sign this, your son and his wife could sell the ranch out from under you without so much as a phone call to notify you it happened. I know, I said. Do you want me to draft a rejection letter? I thought about that for a long moment. Somewhere behind my desk at home, in a cedar chest that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, sat a folded, water-stained page torn from a 1961 recorder's ledger, and a letter in my late wife's handwriting that I had not yet found the strength to open. No, I said finally. I want you to draft something else. I want the trust documentation ready. Everything Margaret and I built. I want it airtight, dated, notarized, and sitting in your safe by the end of the week. And then I want you to help me understand something. If they're already drafting a power of attorney this aggressive 6 weeks after I nearly died on that land, what else are they already planning? Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she opened a drawer, pulled out a legal pad, and started writing. Let's find out, she said. It took Diane 11 days to answer that question, and what she found confirmed something I had begun to suspect the moment I saw the wine, the good plates, the soft music playing from a speaker that had never once been turned on for me in 4 years. A former colleague of hers at a Denver title company had flagged an unusual pattern of inquiries, 3 separate preliminary title searches on the Whitfield Creek Ranch parcel, run over the past 4 months by a commercial real estate broker named Marcus Bell, working on behalf of an entity called Highland Ridge Development Group. Title searches like that are a matter of public record. Anyone can request one. But 3 of them, spaced out carefully over 4 months, on a property that wasn't for sale, wasn't in foreclosure, and had no reason to be under any kind of scrutiny at all. That told a story. Who's Marcus Bell? I asked, though some old, tired part of me had already guessed the shape of the answer before I finished the question. Give me a few days, Diane said. I didn't need a few days. That evening, I sat in my study with the lights off, working through a habit I'd developed in the weeks since the accident, without ever quite admitting to myself why I'd developed it. I had begun quietly reviewing the footage from the 4 trail cameras mounted around the ranch's outbuildings. Cameras I had installed 2 years earlier for entirely ordinary reasons, to keep an eye on coyotes near the calving pens. It had never once occurred to me, mounting those cameras, that I would one day be using them to watch my own family. On a clip from 8 days earlier, time-stamped just after 10 in the morning while I'd been at a physical therapy appointment in town, I watched Vanessa walk the fence line along the northern boundary of the property with a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of casual blazer that costs more than my monthly pension check. They stopped near the old windmill, and though the audio was thin and broken by wind, I caught enough of it to understand what I was looking at. He gestured toward the mountains. She nodded, laughing at something he said, and put her hand briefly, familiarly, on his forearm in a way that had nothing to do with business at all. I didn't know it yet. Sitting alone in that dark study with the glow of the laptop screen the only light in the room. But that man was about to become the second half of a twist neither Vanessa nor Derek would see coming until it was far too late to matter. Because Marcus Bell wasn't working for my daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law was working for Marcus Bell, and she was about to find out exactly how disposable she'd become the moment his development deal no longer needed her married name attached to it. I called Diane the next morning and told her what I'd seen. She was quiet for a long moment. "Walter," she said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. This is no longer a family disagreement about paperwork. If what you're describing is accurate, your daughter-in-law may be planning something that goes well beyond a power of attorney. I think it's time to bring in someone who specializes in elder fraud investigations, and I think, given what happened in that creek bed, we should also be documenting your physical safety." I sat with that for a long moment, looking out my study window at the same stretch of pasture where I'd been lying 6 weeks earlier, listening to my daughter-in-law calculate whether my death would be convenient. "Do it," I said. "All of it. But Diane, I don't want this stopped yet. I told you before, and I mean it more now than I did then. I want to see exactly how far she's willing to go. I want it in writing, in her own hand, before this ends. Because a woman like that doesn't stop the first time she's caught. She just gets quieter about the second attempt." I was right about that. But I was about to learn just how quiet and just how ruthless the second attempt would be. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Derek and Vanessa arrived at the house without calling ahead, which had become unusual enough on its own to put me on guard the moment I heard tires on the gravel drive. They came into the kitchen together, and this time there was no wine, no good plates, no soft music. Vanessa was carrying a leather folder I hadn't seen before, and beside her stood a thin, nervous man in an ill-fitting gray suit I recognized instantly for what he was, the same way I'd recognized 100 of his kind over 31 years sitting across desks from people trying to make a fraud look like paperwork, a notary. "Dad," Derek said, and his voice had a hard edge to it now, an edge that hadn't been there 6 weeks earlier, an edge I understood, with a cold clarity, had been put there by someone else. "We need to talk. And this time it isn't a conversation, it's already decided." Vanessa opened the folder and slid a document across my own kitchen table. The same table where Margaret and I had eaten 10,000 meals together over 38 years. And I looked down at a document titled Medical and Financial Directive, bearing at the very bottom, in a hand I recognized with a slow, sick lurch of recognition, my own signature, a signature I had never given. "You're not thinking clearly, Walter," Vanessa said, and her voice had lost every trace of the warmth from 6 weeks earlier. "Everyone's seen it since the accident. The falls, the confusion, the way you sit alone out here talking to a woman who's been dead for almost a year. We had Dr. Whitmore's notes reviewed by a specialist. We're not doing this to hurt you. We're doing this because somebody has to be responsible, and clearly you can't be anymore." I sat very still, looking down at a forged version of my own name, and I felt something settle inside my chest that was neither fear nor rage, but something colder and steadier than either. The particular, focused calm of a man who has just been handed, by the people trying to destroy him, exactly the piece of evidence he needed most. I looked up at my son. "Derek," I said quietly, "look at me, not at her, at me. Is this really what you want?" For one long moment, something moved behind my son's eyes. The same crack I'd seen in the hospital hallway. The same flicker of a boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in the truck, on the drive home from cattle sales. Still buried somewhere under 4 years of Vanessa's careful architecture. And then Marcus Bell's silver-haired shadow must have passed across his mind, because the crack closed, and Derek's voice came out flat and rehearsed. "It's already notarized, Dad. We just need your fingerprint to confirm identity for the bank. It'll only take a minute. I looked at the notary, whose hands were shaking almost as badly as mine had been shaking, genuinely, in that creek bed 6 weeks earlier. I looked at the forged signature at the bottom of a document that would have handed my dead wife's entire legacy into the hands of two people who had already, once, decided the heat might do the job for them. And then, for the first time since I'd woken up alone in a dry creek bed with a meadowlark singing over my broken leg, I let them see exactly how wrong they'd been about the man they thought they'd already buried. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter, unhurried, and set it down on the table between us, screen facing up, already recording. Before anyone signs anything, I said, I want to make sure we all understand exactly what's happening here. For the record. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the phone and back to my face, and for the first time since she'd walked into my kitchen, I watched something like uncertainty pass behind her carefully composed expression. Walter, there's no need to. There's every need, I said. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to use across a desk from a nervous seller trying to hide a lien on a piece of land, because right now, sitting on this table, is a document with my signature on it that I never wrote. And I'd like the man who just notarized it to explain on camera how he verified the identity of a person who wasn't in the room when he stamped it. The notary went the color of old paper. He picked up his briefcase so fast he knocked his own chair backward, and he was out the front door and down the porch steps before Derek had even finished saying his name. You planned this, Vanessa said. And the warmth was completely gone now, replaced by something narrow and furious. You've been playing us this whole time. No, I said. I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. Though I understand why you wouldn't recognize it. You've never once had to. I want to tell you what happened over the next few minutes, because I think about it often, and I think it says more about my son than almost anything else in this entire story. Derek didn't defend his wife. He didn't defend himself. He stood in the doorway of my kitchen, staring at the forged signature on the table between us, and I watched 34 years of assumptions about who his father actually was collapse across his face all at once. Dad, he said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was 17 years old and had wrecked his first truck. I swear to you, I didn't know it was forged. I thought you'd already agreed to it verbally, back at dinner. Vanessa said you'd said yes, and you just believed her instead of asking me, I said. The way you believed her instead of stopping her in that creek bed. He flinched like I'd struck him. Good. Some flinches are the beginning of healing, even when they don't feel like it at the time. Vanessa snatched the forged document off the table, and I let her. I had photographed both sides of it the night before, when I'd first suspected what they were building toward, using a scanner in Diane Ashcroft's office under her direct supervision. So the copy existed in a form no court would ever question. Let her take the original. It had already done exactly what I needed it to do. This isn't over, she said, backing toward the door, her voice shaking now with something closer to panic than confidence. You think one recording changes anything? We have doctor's notes. We have witnesses who'll say you've been unstable since Margaret died. You're an old man talking to a dead woman's photograph every night, Walter. Nobody's going to believe a word you say over us. I don't need anybody to believe me over you, I said quietly. I need them to believe the paper. And paper doesn't lie, Vanessa. It never has. That's the one thing 31 years in this business taught me better than anything else. People lie constantly. Paper just sits there, patiently, waiting for someone honest enough to finally read it. She left without another word, slamming the truck door hard enough that I heard the mirror rattle from inside the house. Derek stood in my kitchen a moment longer, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a boy. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something raw and frightened and, for the first time in a very long while, entirely honest. What happens now, he asked. That depends entirely on you, I said. But right now, I need you to leave too. I need to think, and so do you. He left. I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time after the sound of the truck faded down the gravel drive, looking at the empty space, where a forged document with my name on it had been sitting 20 minutes earlier, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done since the funeral. I got up, walked to the mantel, and picked up the framed photograph of Margaret standing in front of the old windmill, laughing at something just out of frame. Her hair loose in the wind the way she always wore it when nobody but me was around to see it. "I did exactly what you told me to do," I said to the photograph, and my voice came out rougher than I expected. I stayed patient. I let them show me who they really are before I moved a single piece. But Margaret, I don't know if I have the stomach for what comes next, watching him fall apart, even after everything. The house didn't answer me, of course. It never does. But I stood there a long while anyway, holding that photograph, because some conversations aren't really about getting an answer. They're about needing, for just a few minutes, to not carry the weight completely alone. That night, Diane called with a piece of information that would ultimately bring the entire structure down. Marcus Bell, it turned out, wasn't simply a broker chasing a development deal. He was under active investigation by the State Attorney General's office for a nearly identical scheme 2 years earlier in a neighboring county. An elderly widower, a forged power of attorney, a hard money loan secured against inherited ranch land, and a foreclosure that had left the man's grown children homeless and the land in the hands of a shell company traced, eventually and quietly, back to Highland Ridge Development Group. "He's done this before," Diane said. "And Walter, this part matters. In that case, the daughter-in-law who helped him wasn't a full partner. She was a tool. Once the land transferred, Bell's company cut her out of the deal entirely, and she was left facing federal fraud charges completely alone, while he walked away with clean hands and a very good lawyer." I sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains against a sky full of stars, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward Vanessa in the middle of all of this. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of grim, exhausted recognition. She wasn't the architect of this scheme. She was the second victim of it, walking eagerly toward a cliff edge she couldn't yet see, propelled there by a man who had already discarded a woman exactly like her once before. "I want you to reach out to her," I said finally. "Not Derek, Vanessa, directly, privately, before anything else happens. She needs to see the file on Bell's last victim before she signs anything else with him." Diane was quiet for a moment. "That's a remarkably generous thing to offer someone who left you to die in a creek bed, Walter." "It's not generosity," I said. "It's strategy. A cornered woman with nothing left to lose is dangerous. A woman who understands she's about to become someone else's discarded tool might finally start telling the truth about everything else. Either way, I want her to know exactly what she's standing on before this goes any further. What she does with that information is her choice, but I won't be the reason she never had it." What happened over the following 2 weeks unfolded faster than I expected and in a direction none of us, not me, not Diane, and certainly not Vanessa, had fully anticipated. Deanne arranged a quiet meeting, ostensibly about estate mediation, and slid across the table a single printed page from the neighboring county's court filings, the name of Bell's previous partner, the charges she alone had faced, the sentence she alone had served, while Marcus Bell's name appeared nowhere on the indictment at all. I wasn't in the room for it. Diane told me afterward that Vanessa read the page twice, in complete silence, and then asked a single question. "Does Derek know any of this?" "No," Diane told her, "not yet." Vanessa didn't say anything else. She folded the page, put it in her purse, and left. I didn't hear from her directly for 9 days. What I heard instead, through Diane and through the increasingly erratic behavior of my own son, who had moved out of the house he shared with Vanessa and back into his childhood bedroom without offering a single explanation, was that something inside their marriage, and inside whatever remained of Vanessa's arrangement with Marcus Bell, had begun to come apart at exactly the seams I'd hoped it would. The ranch's 140th anniversary was coming up that September, a date Margaret had circled on our kitchen calendar the year before she died, planning, back when she still believed she'd be alive to see it, a celebration that would bring together every rancher, every old family friend, every person along that valley who had ever leased grazing rights or borrowed equipment or shared a fence line with the Whitfields across 4 generations. I had almost canceled it after her death. In the end, I decided to hold it anyway, exactly as she'd planned it, because some things you finish not because you have the heart for them, but because the person who wanted them finished no longer can. I didn't know it yet, standing in my kitchen making the guest list that Vanessa herself had helped Margaret draft 2 years earlier, that the ranch's 140th anniversary was about to become the place where every single piece of this, the forged signature, the hidden deed, the man who had already discarded one woman exactly like her, would finally collide in front of nearly 200 witnesses at once. The morning of the anniversary, I stood in front of the mirror in a shirt Margaret had bought me for our 40th wedding anniversary, and never gotten the chance to see me wear. And I thought about the 6 weeks that had passed since a forged signature sat on my kitchen table. Derek had moved back into the house permanently by then, sleeping most nights in the guest room, barely speaking, working through something in himself I couldn't do for him, and had, for the first time in his life, stopped trying to. Vanessa had not filed for divorce. She hadn't moved out of the Denver condo. But she also hadn't spoken to Derek in 9 days, and according to Diane, who had quietly kept a line of communication open with her the whole time, Vanessa had stopped returning Marcus Bell's calls entirely. After the third one went to voicemail with a message that made even Diane, a woman who had heard every kind of ugliness a person could put into a threat, go quiet on the phone with me for a long moment before repeating it. He told her, Diane said, that if she backed out now, after everything she'd already helped him build, she'd find out exactly how the last woman felt. And that she should ask herself who a judge would believe, a respected commercial developer with 20 years of clean paperwork, or a housewife with a forged notary stamp and a motive. I sat with that information for a long time before the anniversary. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I promised you honesty, and I intend to keep that promise all the way through. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. And I felt something close to sorrow for a woman who had walked eagerly into her own destruction, chasing a life I thought she deserved, only to discover, the way so many people eventually do, that the person who'd promised her that life had already used the exact same promise on someone else, and would use it again on someone after her, without so much as a flicker of hesitation. The anniversary drew nearly 200 people that afternoon, ranching families from 4 counties, old friends of Margaret's parents, who remembered her as a girl chasing barn cats across this same yard, the county extension agent who'd known both of us for 20 years, and my 9-year-old granddaughter, Lily, who arrived with Derek that morning in a yellow dress Margaret had picked out for her 8th birthday, and never gotten to see her wear either. Lily found me setting out folding chairs near the old windmill an hour before anyone else arrived, and she stood next to me for a while in the particular comfortable silence only children seem to know how to hold. Then she asked me a question that stopped my hands completely still on the chair I was unfolding. Grandpa, is Mommy in trouble because she wanted the ranch instead of you? I looked down at her, this small person who had somehow, in the middle of everything the adults around her had spent months trying to hide, arrived at the exact center of the truth without any help from any of us. Something like that, sweetheart, I said. Sometimes grown-ups get so busy wanting things that they forget the people are more important than the things. That's dumb, Lily said, with the flat, unshakable certainty only a 9-year-old can summon. Grandma always said the land doesn't mean anything without the people you share it with. She told me that. Right here, by this windmill. I had to turn away from her for a moment and pretend to be very interested in a folding chair leg, because I did not want my granddaughter to see her grandfather cry in front of 200 people's worth of empty chairs. Vanessa arrived at 2:30, alone, in a car I didn't recognize, and I watched from across the yard as she made her way through the gathering crowd with the careful, controlled composure of a woman walking into a room she knows is about to turn against her. Derek saw her before she reached us. I watched his shoulders go rigid, watched something pass between them across 30 feet of trampled grass that I couldn't read and didn't try to. Marcus Bell arrived 20 minutes later, uninvited, in a black SUV that pulled directly up to the fence line rather than parking in the field with everyone else's trucks. He got out wearing the same expensive casual blazer from the trail camera footage, and he walked toward the gathering with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once, in his entire career, expected to be told no. I want to tell you exactly how the next 20 minutes unfolded, because it happened faster and with less drama than you might expect from everything that led up to it, which I've come to believe is exactly how the truth usually arrives. Not with fireworks, with a single quiet sentence, spoken at the right moment to the right person, in front of enough witnesses that nobody can later pretend they didn't hear it. I found Bell before he found me, standing near the refreshment table with a glass of lemonade he clearly hadn't been offered, surveying the ranch's boundary line with the flat, appraising eyes of a man mentally subdividing land that wasn't his. "Mr. Bell," I said, and he turned, mildly surprised that I already knew his name. "I understand you have quite a lot of experience valuing land like this." "I do," he said, recovering his composure smoothly, extending a hand I didn't take. "Beautiful property, Mr. Coleman. I imagine at your age, managing it alone must be quite a burden." "It was," I said. "For about 6 weeks back in June, it very nearly killed me. I understand you're familiar with that particular kind of misfortune. Isn't that roughly what happened to Harold Grissom up in Park County 2 years ago? Fell behind on a loan he never actually understood the terms of, secured against land he thought was protected. Lost everything. I believe his daughter-in-law served 18 months for the paperwork. You, I understand, were never charged with anything at all." I watched every trace of easy confidence drain out of Marcus Bell's face in real time, replaced by the particular stillness of a predator who has just realized the ground beneath him is no longer solid. "I don't know what you think you know," he said quietly, "but I'd be very careful about repeating unverified allegations in front of 200 witnesses, Mr. Coleman." "They're not allegations," I said. "They're a matter of public record. I spent 31 years reading exactly that kind of record for a living, Mr. Bell, and I promise you I read very carefully." By then, Vanessa had reached us, her face gone pale beneath her careful makeup, and I watched her understand, in the space of about 4 seconds, that whatever fragile arrangement she'd been clinging to with this man had just been laid bare in front of the one crowd on earth that could destroy her standing in this valley for good. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight. "What is he talking about?" Bell didn't answer her. That, more than anything I could have said myself, told her everything she needed to know. I watched something collapse behind her eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but the particular, disorienting vertigo of a person realizing the solid ground they'd been building their entire future on had never actually existed at all. "You told me Harold Grissom sold voluntarily," she said, her voice rising now, loud enough that heads nearby began to turn. "You told me nobody got hurt." "Vanessa," Bell said, low and warning. "Not here. You used me," she said, and now people were fully turning, the low murmur of conversation around us dying into the particular hush of a crowd, realizing it's about to witness something it wasn't invited to see. "You used me exactly the way you used her, and the second this deal closed, you were going to disappear and let me hold every piece of it, weren't you?" It wasn't a question. Marcus Bell didn't answer it, which was, in its own way, the only answer that mattered. Derek pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, and for one terrible second, I thought he was moving toward Bell with violence in his eyes, and some old, tired part of me was almost ready to let him. Instead, he stopped in front of his wife, ignoring Bell completely, and said the first genuinely honest thing I'd heard him say in months. "Is any of it true? The forged directive, all of it. Was it his idea or yours?" Vanessa's composure finally broke completely. Right there in front of the crowd that had gathered around Margaret's windmill to celebrate 140 years of a family Vanessa had spent the last several months trying to erase. "It started as his idea," she said, and her voice cracked. "But I let it become mine too. I wanted it, Derek. I wanted it so badly I stopped caring for what it would cost. And now I don't have any of it. I don't have the deal, I don't have you, and apparently I don't even have him." I watched my son stand there, absorbing that confession in front of 200 people, and something in his posture changed. Not collapse, the way it had in my kitchen weeks earlier, but a kind of quiet, exhausted straightening, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for far longer than he'd admitted even to himself. That was the moment I stepped forward with the folder Diane had prepared. Though I want to be clear, I did not read a single number, a single account, a single piece of the trust's financial structure aloud to that crowd. What I held up instead, in front of everyone Margaret had ever loved along that valley, was a single torn page from a leather ledger dated 1961, protected in a clear archival sleeve, and I asked only one question of the woman standing in front of me. Do you understand now, Vanessa, that this land was never yours to threaten me for? Not because Derek and I decided it wouldn't be. Because Margaret's grandmother made certain of it 60 years before either of us was born. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence in front of that crowd was confession enough. The rest of what needed to happen legally happened quietly, in the days that followed, in Diane's office, rather than in front of a crowd of witnesses. Vanessa signing an agreement acknowledging she would not contest the trust's terms and would not pursue any future claim against the estate, in exchange for Diane's promise not to pursue the forged notary matter criminally, a mercy I insisted on, against Diane's professional advice, because I had already watched one woman get destroyed by Marcus Bell, and did not have the stomach to help him watch a second one go down while he walked away clean, again, unless the law absolutely forced my hand. The State Attorney General's office, working from the documentation Diane had already compiled independently, opened its own investigation into Bell within the month, this time with a witness willing, finally, to talk. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later, quiet and unremarkable compared to everything that had led up to it, the way most endings are once the real drama has already burned itself out somewhere else. Vanessa moved to Colorado Springs. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance at the county fair the following spring, that she'd taken a job managing a property staging company and was, by all accounts, trying to build something honest out of the wreckage of what she'd tried to steal. I hope that's true. I've made my peace with never knowing for certain Derek stayed. That's the part of this story I still find myself sitting with some evenings, out on the porch, long after the anniversary and the divorce and the last of Diane Ashcroft's paperwork had been signed, sealed, and filed away in a fireproof box beside the original 1961 ledger page it had taken 60 years to matter. My son didn't go back to Denver. He didn't go back to his business development job with its portfolios and its very little actual work with his hands. He asked me, 3 weeks after the anniversary, sitting across the same kitchen table where a forged signature had once nearly ended everything between us, whether I would teach him to run cattle the way his grandfather had taught me. I want to tell you that I said yes immediately, with an open heart and no hesitation at all. I didn't. I sat with the question for a long moment, looking at the boy who had stood 3 feet away from me in a dry creek bed, and we're figuring it out instead of I've got you, Dad. And I made him wait for my answer the way he'd once made me wait, without knowing it, for 51 minutes under a white summer sky. You'd be starting from nothing, I said finally. No experience. No guarantee I'll be patient with you. And no guarantee I'll ever fully trust you the way I did before that summer. That part isn't coming back easily, Derek. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm asking you to let me earn it, however long that takes. I said yes. It has been 11 months since that conversation, and I won't stand here and tell you it's been easy, or that every wound closed clean, because that isn't how real healing works, and I promised you the truth all the way through this story, not the version that fits neatly into a bow at the end. There are still mornings I watch my son saddle a horse near that same dry creek bed and feel my chest tighten in a way I don't think will ever fully release. There are still evenings he catches me talking quietly to Margaret's photograph on the mantel and doesn't interrupt, just sits down beside me in silence, the way Lily once did by the windmill, because some things a person learns to share simply by staying present for them, over and over, until presence itself becomes its own kind of apology. 2 months ago, going through the last of the boxes in the cedar chest that had held the 1961 ledger page, I finally found the strength to open the letter Margaret had left for me, the one I'd carried unread through the entire ordeal because some part of me had been afraid of what a woman who could see this coming 3 months before her death might have written to the husband she was leaving behind, to face it alone. It wasn't a prophecy. It wasn't a warning about Vanessa by name or Derek's weakness, or any of the specific shape the danger eventually took. It was simpler than that, and somehow harder to read because of it. Walter, she wrote, in the handwriting I'd know anywhere on earth, don't let your love for him turn into a debt he thinks he's owed. Let him earn the ranch the way I earned it from my mother, not by inheriting it, but by proving he understands what it actually costs to keep something worth protecting. And if he never learns that, love him anyway. Just don't hand him the land until he does. I read that letter sitting in the same chair where I'd sat holding her photograph the night the forged directive appeared on my kitchen table, and I understood, finally, that my wife hadn't protected this ranch from Derek out of distrust. She'd protected it so that whatever version of her son eventually proved himself worthy of it would have to become that version, honestly, in daylight, in front of witnesses, the same way the land itself had always been claimed and reclaimed by every Whitfield woman who came before her. Not through inheritance handed down as an assumption, but through the slow, deliberate work of earning a name that could stand up in front of 140 years of scrutiny and not once need to hide. Lily comes out to the ranch most weekends now. Last month, standing by the old windmill in a dress that wasn't yellow this time, she asked me if I was still sad about Grandma, and I told her the truth, that I was, and that I probably always would be a little, and that being a little sad forever isn't actually a bad way to carry someone you loved, as long as you don't let the sadness be the only thing you carry. She thought about that for a while, the way she thinks about everything, and then she said something I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count since. I think Grandma knew you'd be okay, she said. That's probably why she didn't leave you a note telling you exactly what to do. She left you the kind of thing that makes you figure it out yourself. That's more like a trust, right? Not the money kind. The other kind. Out of the mouths of 9-year-olds. I still walk the fence line most mornings. The same way I did the day my leg broke in that dry creek bed, though I take it slower now, and I keep my phone in a pocket that actually zips shut. Derek walks it with me most days too, and we don't talk much while we do it, which suits us both fine. Some conversations don't need words. Some of them just need two people willing to keep showing up on the same stretch of ground, morning after morning, until trust stops being a thing you're promised and starts being a thing you simply quietly are. If you've ever had to watch the people closest to you show you exactly who they really were before you could finally believe it. I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you believe, the way I've come to believe, that the truth eventually finds its way to daylight no matter how carefully it's been buried, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one.